Many people are working to halt climate change, but only with limited success. Why have climate researchers been unable to halt global warming?
I've been working in research for decades. I publish the scientific results, but that's achieved relatively little.
Why doesn't scientific data about climate change lead to action?
I guess I haven't been doing it right, or there's been a significant drop in global emissions.
Coal, oil, and gas continue to be used as fuel. Why?
The world would be very different if it weren't for the dirty deeds of the fossil fuel lobbyists.
Climate activists often end up on trial, but can their controversial tactics force change?
Of course there's resistance, but we might ultimately be successful.
But time is running out. Why is it taking the world so long to act?
We can't assume that just because society feels ethically compelled to save the world, it will. It's psychology, mindset, that determines whether it'll succeed or not.
Researcher Mojib Latif is trying to find the best way. How can we still save the planet?
Unbelievable. I've never seen anything like this before.
Climate scientists have been warning about global warming for decades, but their words have fallen on deaf ears.
Knowledge has failed to translate into action. We need to communicate the issues in a different, more emotional way.
Germany's last generation protest movement emerged in 2021. Co-founder Lea Bonacera went on a hunger strike, demanding a meeting with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz.
I'm not sure you heard what I said. The fate of millions of people is at stake.
The young activists planned their first protests in this Berlin church. The group intensified its strategy after meeting with Chancellor Scholz. Their convictions are based on data provided by scientists such as Mojib Latif.
Cycling onto the runway, climate activists have occupied the Hamburg airport. Flight operations are paralyzed.
We can't stand by while our planet burns and the German government's obsession with fossil fuels stokes the fire.
I can't condone the tactics of the last generation movement. No one is above the law, even if their goals are worthy.
It's not that I want to anger people. I don't enjoy annoying them. But I've read the science, and I'm trying to figure out how this can work. Of course, it's stressful for people, for me too. And of course, the hate directed at us is horrible. I think the last generation is very focused on where we want to go, and we know that this method has often worked. Why shouldn't it work for us now?
When is protest effective? When does it do more harm than good? Questions that researchers have been exploring for decades.
Es ist eine Gefahr, dass man auftritt als There's a danger that protesters come across as missionaries, do-gooders, or know-it-alls. You have to be careful to strike the right tone and not make yourself out to be a savior of the world.
I believe scientists have a responsibility to step up and say, it can't go on like this, and even to go on strike as an act of resistance.
I think I would lose a lot of credibility if I did that. That's why I don't. Credibility is crucial. A lot of people listen to what I say. That's a huge asset, and I don't want to jeopardize it.
Meanwhile, the last generation activists are facing pressure, from raids to arrests and charges.
There are 13 charges against me from the first protests I did with Last Generation. Of course I'm upset by the prospect of going to jail.
It's a bit unfair. The people responsible for climate change aren't on trial.
Protest challenges people, society, politics, democracy. And of course there will be resistance, but we might ultimately achieve our goals.
We can't allow an environmental RAF to develop.
The Last Generation rejects anything to do with sabotage or even terrorism or violent damage to property.
Mashed potatoes and paint can always be wiped off. But even so, many see the young activists as anything but peaceful.
We are essentially radical, but not in our methods. No matter what happens, in terms of the Last Generation strategy, we'll always be peaceful protesters because that's vital to a successful resistance.
The terrorism of the 1970s and 80s in Germany showed that you can't bring the state to its knees with violence. You can only lose.
Leah Bonacera has been sentenced to a fine of 1,800 euros by the Berlin District Court.
A fine is not a prison sentence. To be honest, I'm relieved. It would be completely disproportionate to send her to prison. I still think it's a bit counterproductive, because now there's a lot of talk about this form of protest, and less about the actual issue, which is how do we reduce greenhouse gas emissions?
An issue that's been debated since the 1980s. The media finally took up the story after scientists presented the evidence.
Altogether, this evidence represents a very strong case, in my opinion, that the greenhouse effect has been detected and it is changing our climate now.
James Henson gave the world a wake-up call and put the issue on the global political agenda. That Spiegel headline in 1986 was totally over the top, but in a way marked the beginning of the public discussion in Germany about climate change.
The Framework Convention on Climate Change was adopted at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. The signatory countries agreed to prevent dangerous climate change.
I believe it is very important for Germany's reputation in the world, and even more so for future generations, that we see the writing on the wall.
As a young scientist, I was convinced that we had the data, the climate would be protected, and the problem solved. I would never have expected the massive backlash from lobby groups that ultimately prevented progress on climate protection, which is why emissions continue to rise to this day.
Founded in 1989, the Global Climate Coalition has been one of the biggest lobby groups. Corporations including Ford and Exxon spend millions promoting false information. For several years after its merger with Chrysler, Mercedes-Benz was part of the group, challenging the idea of human-induced climate change.
The management of Exxon, for example, financed advertorials in major U.S. newspapers such as the New York Times for years. These look like normal opinion pieces, but they're paid for. Exxon systematically spread false information. Exxon was up to date with the scientific research. Our studies showed that Exxon's projections were even more accurate. Social scientists have shown that hundreds of millions of dollars have been pumped in every year to lobby against climate protection measures, and obviously very successfully.
What happened with climate change was a bit like what happened with smoking. It was established that smoking is harmful to health, but then the smokers' lobby, the tobacco companies, started to set up fake institutes.
Angefangen, eben sogenannte Fake-Institute zu gründen.
The tobacco industry is on the defensive. It's a similar situation to 10 years ago when it was suggested that there is a link between smoking and lung cancer. The Royal College caused the shares of American tobacco companies to fall sharply in April '62.
Did the Royal College itself carry out any research investigations or
Hat das britische Ärztekollegium irgendwelche Forschungen durchgeführt und ist es zu irgendwelchen neuartigen Ergebnissen gekommen? Die Antwort ist nein.
Da wurden Menschen dann hingestellt.
People who had no idea about the issue made statements and acted as if they did, arguing against the evidence and sowing doubt, saying, well, it hasn't actually been proven that smoking is really harmful to health.
For decades, large sectors of industry, the petroleum industry, the fossil fuel industry in general, have used false claims to attempt to save their business models. Spending millions on smear campaigns that undermine the credibility of scientists. We can't carry on like this. We can't expect self-restraint from industry. We have to get politicians to take deliberate and effective action. To repeat, the climate is like a runaway train. Even if you pull the emergency brake, the train won't stop immediately. It'll keep going for hundreds of meters. That's the situation we're in.
You have to realize that many people in business, in management positions, but also ordinary citizens, don't want to believe that climate change is happening. There's a huge market for excuses for doing nothing about it. And these lobbyists serve that market with arguments that are all too readily repeated.
Are people unwilling to acknowledge things that require them to change their behavior?
My experience is that it's incredibly difficult to let go of habits. Lobbyists know that all too well.
To show why, let's look at a brain. You can see there are specific regions in the center of the brain that control our actions subconsciously, so to speak. There are two spheres, and this here is the basal ganglia. This controls subconscious activities. When we decide to take conscious action, that's up here at the front. Up here in the upper area is where the signals are sent from. But once this is automated, it happens subconsciously. You don't have to think about it anymore.
Why is this so difficult? Isn't change also built into the brain somewhere?
What we can do is overwrite a habit with a new habit. We have to identify actions or activities as a new habit, because we can't just switch off the old one. We have to decide what is a better alternative.
We're running out of time. We can't wait for new habits to become ingrained. How can we change now?
It would be nice if there was a button somewhere that we could just hit and the brain would change. Mobility behavior is a good example. It takes time to get used to new forms of movement. But once they're learned, they stay learned. The problem today is, whether it's lobby groups or the way we imagine the future, is that we stick to what we know and try to protect it.
Is this another reason why the expansion of renewable energies is stalling? After an initial boom in Germany, things began to go downhill around 2017. Laws prevented expansion, and companies left the country.
Legislation on renewable energies has been modified in such a way that the expansion has been massively hindered and has practically come to a standstill. We even saw an economics minister talking about how it was costing trillions. A claim he couldn't back up, and saying the energy transition was unaffordable. There was a whole PR campaign and all sorts of stories.
Proving the extent of the carbon lobby's power is difficult. But one example, over 600 lobbyists were officially accredited at the 2022 UN Climate Conference in Egypt.
More and more lobbyists are running around at climate conferences on behalf of industry. And then, what about the president of the 2023 Climate Conference?
The president of the 2023 Climate Conference is also the head of a huge oil company.
A conflict of interest in the fight against fossil fuels.
That's a no-go. It's unacceptable.
Wir wissen, dass die Energiequellen, die wir heute benutzen, weiterhin Teil unseres Energiemixes für die voraussehbare Zukunft bleiben.
Personally, I feel like the guy in Groundhog Day. Time and time again, the lobbyists show up and manage to get everything done their way.
Tatsächlich erfolgreich in ihrem Sinne alles Mögliche entscheiden lassen zu können.
This is really frightening.
The situation in the forests near Luptain remains tense.
Fires continue to rage in the dry forests near Luptain.
As someone who sits at a desk and makes computer simulations, actually seeing it is different.
The village of Kreuzrade was evacuated yesterday.
Climate change is causing more frequent extreme weather, including longer dry spells.
It's unbelievable what a fire can do. It's indescribable. I've never seen anything like it. Everything is destroyed.
It's the extremes that have changed. We either have extremely heavy rainfall, or, like right now, extremely long periods without rain. So we can definitely say yes, we are noticing climate change. We need to acknowledge the need for more investment in coming years to make sure we're okay.
The high cost of extreme weather due to climate change.
In the worst case, it could reach 900 billion euros by 2050.
Climate change is already costing a lot today, several billion euros a year for Germany. But this is just the beginning.
The forest fires in Canada continue to spread. Canada has launched an international appeal for help.
2 weeks of forest fires, now flooding.
A biblical disaster.
It's the fourth night of heavy rainfall in Greece.
A state of emergency has been declared in the region.
Storm Daniel hit the east coast of Libya with full force at the weekend.
Authorities are expecting up to 20,000 deaths in the coastal town of Derna.
Cities and villages especially vulnerable to extreme weather may eventually have to be abandoned. Could a small town in Wales be the first in Europe? Fairborn, a village on the Irish Sea, has recently been making headlines across Europe. The sea level here could rise by as much as 30 centimeters by 2054, making Fairborn vulnerable to flooding from the sea, a nearby estuary, and river runoff flowing down from the hills. Is it already beyond saving?
2054, when the local authority have said that they are no longer spending money on the coastal defence if it breaches. Well, big changes have come along and you adapt. Some of that's painful, some of that you do swiftly and it's effortless.
The problem in this region is that these communities are on the coast, putting them at risk from rising sea levels. We'll eventually have to ask ourselves if it's always worth helping people adapt, if the worst can no longer be prevented. And the decision was made that in Fairborn, it's not.
Dass sie es zumindest in dem Ort Fairborn nicht machen möchte.
People are aware of the effects of climate change, but they're not doing much about it.
I keep telling people that we are running into big problems, okay, but nothing is really happening in terms of climate action. So why do you think nothing happens?
Probably because people don't believe it. They've got to see it to believe it. And slowly but surely they are awakening to what's going on. It's just like the village I live in. We're threatened by being flooded by the sea. They have come to look what they purchased, the houses they purchased that they were going to leave for their generations, for their children, were then spiralling down to being worthless. And that shook them right down to the roots. It shook everybody. You know, how can this happen to us?
I've got no car. I wash once a week. I shower once a week. I wash my hair once a fortnight. When I wash in the sink with my clothes, I save the water and I use it for putting down the toilet.
Right.
And my wants are very few these days.
Yeah. And so this village will be given up. This is what
I don't believe. I'm optimistic. I think with all the clever people we've got in the country, they're bound to come up with some solution.
Well, some solution
to this.
The authorities have since rowed back. Evacuating residents was never on the cards, despite what was said in the last 10 years. But if no more money is spent on coastal protection, the town is in danger of being flooded.
What do you do with 400 houses? 400 families? Every time we have a meeting, we talk to the council about this, and they haven't got an answer. And that is the most frustrating thing. To actually threaten to decommission your village and not know where you're going to put the people is sheer lunacy.
It's a lottery. There are the lucky ones who will be helped, and there are the less lucky ones who won't be. Another example that shows that when faced with the effects of climate change, humanity is helpless.
If the experts are right, Fairborn will one day be lost to the sea. That day is still a long way off, and that makes it hard for us to grasp. That's another reason why people don't act.
How do you see your future? Your future self in 10, 20, 30 years?
It doesn't look too bad.
The interesting thing is that you can see how you're changing, so you can relate to it. The question now is, what's happening in your brain? Do you have an emotional connection to this person? That's the interesting part.
That means I can see myself now as I might look in 20 years, but I still have no feeling at all for what that actually means.
That's it. Do you have a sense of yourself? Or who is this person you see here?
He's completely alien to me.
And that's exactly my point. We've demonstrated what happens in the brain when we imagine the present and the future. This is a view of the brain from below. This is the back of the head. This is the frontal area. When you think about your present, as you're standing here next to me, your brain creates a mental image of yourself. You have a sense of who you are. When you imagine being here in a week, a month, a year, then that changes. This frontal activity decreases. The brain creates an idea of the future, but you're a stranger in that future. This area is much less active. Your future self is a stranger to you.
So that means that because my future self is a stranger, I'm not affected by something that will happen in the future.
Me in 20 years' time is a complete stranger to my brain. That's why it's so easy to live without thinking about the future. It can't defend itself, and that's a problem when it comes to creating long-term change.
Long-term changes are exactly what the student movement Fridays for Future is fighting for. They want the world to act now to give young people a future worth living.
Greta Thunberg demonstrated in front of the Swedish Parliament in Stockholm for more climate protection. It soon became the global protest movement Fridays for Future.
People took to the streets in more than 200 cities in Germany today, calling for more action on climate change.
Friday spokesperson Clara de Vigneault is leading the demonstration.
Here's a picture of the demonstration, and here's the stage.
Fight for it! Are we gonna get it? So what do we want? Ich liebe euch. Danke.
What year was that?
That was 2021. Fridays for Future has become normal for many. It's our job to keep creating new momentum and saying, hey, there's a lot of us, and a lot of people behind us, and listen to us.
But have groups that take a tougher stance, like Last Generation, made Fridays for Future redundant?
I believe we can learn a lot from the anti-nuclear movement in Germany. We can apply some of its lessons, such as the interaction between a more moderate branch of the movement and a more offensive or militant branch. That's an important precondition, that they don't break apart, but at least roughly agree and coordinate. They can exist together, side by side.
Our main aim is to bring people together. Personally, I think it's good that other organizations get more attention, but we still manage to bring people together and show, hey, there's a lot of us across society.
These friendly, peaceful demonstrations inevitably fizzle out. They can't keep getting bigger. The peak was 1.4 million demonstrators in Germany. Then after that, before the pandemic, the numbers dropped significantly.
75% of Germans say that the Fridays for Future protests have had little or no impact on them.
Asked about the influence of Fridays for Future on their attitude towards climate change, 4% answered very strong, 19% strong, 35% less strong, and 40% not at all.
The important thing is to see the fight against the climate crisis as a marathon. We've got to keep at it.
The climate activists say everything should already have been done. With other issues in the past, and I'd even include the anti-nuclear movement, there wasn't the same urgency. People, of course, wanted to get rid of nuclear power plants as fast as possible, but there weren't any tipping points. In 2, 3, or 5 years, this is a challenge for which there's no solution, no silver bullet.
I'd say Fridays for Future got the ball rolling. We managed to get climate protection laws passed. We made them happen in the first place. The Constitutional Court ruled on climate action. There are lots of examples of the climate movement bringing about change.
A victory for the climate activists. Their constitutional lawsuit was successful.
The Climate Protection Act is partially unconstitutional and must be amended.
In their quest to change popular opinion, Clara Duvigneau and Mojib Latif have been inspired by one of history's greatest natural scientists. Alexander von Humboldt gathered data from around the globe nearly 2 centuries ago. He was even the first to observe man-made climate change in Venezuela.
He clearly refers in his journals to the fact that all the smoke and fumes coming out of industrial chimneys would change the atmosphere, and predicts that this will have an impact.
We haven't actually learned anything. We just carry on destroying the forests. We destroy the environment in all sorts of ways. And somehow, we can't convince people to stop.
Scientists are expanding on Humboldt's work at Berlin's Botanic Garden. Researcher Jonas Zimmermann has collected and counted tiny diatoms in the Arctic Ocean, which are crucial for the entire Arctic ecosystem. The more diatoms there are, the healthier the water. But Zimmermann has documented their decline.
Diatoms lived on the underside of ice. They're a food source for krill, the crustaceans that whales and penguins feed on. But now that the glaciers are retreating, there's less krill, and less krill is leading to fewer whales.
Nowhere is climate change more evident than in the Arctic. Mojib Latif visited the region back in 2010.
I wanted to see for myself what was happening in the Arctic. I knew from my research that major changes were occurring. But it's not the same as actually seeing it, especially the glaciers. The vast loss of ice is breathtaking. In climatological terms, the ocean has various functions. On the one hand, it absorbs heat, which slows down global warming. But on the other, it also absorbs carbon dioxide, which humans release into the atmosphere. This is both a blessing and a curse. It's slowing down global warming, but the water is becoming acidic, and marine organisms are suffering as a result.
Tell me the number of personnel you're dropping off.
We're heading to the mesocosms, which are kind of huge test tubes that allow us to examine under realistic conditions what increased levels of CO2 are doing to organisms. We don't know exactly how the ecosystems react to ocean acidification. We're very excited to find out if long-term experiments produce the same results as the short-term ones. We learned a lot from these experiments. We can now develop computer models to project changes that will occur as a result of carbon uptake. We're now able to predict what will happen if we carry on as usual.
We've all been witnessing these dramatic developments for decades, including the automotive industry. But back in the early 1990s, Mercedes-Benz still described its latest super luxury S-Class as environmentally friendly.
We at Mercedes-Benz are proud to be setting new standards and pioneering new environmental technologies with our new S-Class.
To many, it was a clear-cut case of greenwashing. The new Mercedes-Benz S-Class was decried by environmental experts.
The S-Class weighs around 2.2 times more than an average conventional car. The manufacturing process produces about 52 tons of waste, which is 2.2 times more than with an average car and amounts to about as much waste as 2 people in Germany produce in their entire lives.
We advertise our green credentials because we believe that we are making a great contribution and will continue to do so in the future.
Take the Mercedes S-Class. This really is scandalous in a country like ours. These cars are so heavy. The energy cost of powering them is truly appalling. We haven't made any progress in the transportation sector, especially with automotive traffic. Cars have become bigger and bigger, and in cities where space is in short supply, SUVs are squeezing out everything else.
It was the largest S-Class ever made. People were annoyed because it was so wide it couldn't fit on car trains.
Okay.
And this is one of the smallest SUVs on the market. The best-selling SUV in Germany is the T-Roc. If you do some research, you'll discover it weighs about 1,300 kilos, 1,500 kilos even. That's the same as a 1980s S-Class.
It's just as big if you look at them like this.
Slimmer, but 10 centimeters taller. And this car has worse aerodynamics than this one. If you add up how many SUVs are sold in Germany and how much they weigh compared to normal cars, we're talking an additional 750 million tons per year, or 500,000 VW Golfs.
Oder eben eine halbe Million VW Golfs.
What's so great about it?
Was die Leute faszinierend finden,
what people like is that it's taller. Almost 40% of cars in Germany are SUVs, and basically on the road you're elevated. But you can no longer see anyone else. You can't see children. Imagine that. A mother's at the wheel and here's a child.
You can't see it.
You could have 9 children in a row and only the 9th is visible. There's a heated discussion in America. There are even studies about child fatalities caused because drivers can't see when moving around when driving normally. 7,000 accidents and 200 deaths a year because people don't see these children. In an SUV, you sit higher than in a normal vehicle. And that gives people a sense of security and no doubt also of superiority.
I'm having déjà vu. When you compare the two cars, you can see we haven't made any progress in terms of environmental protection and resource conservation. And that's just not okay.
People who drive SUVs believe they've made an environmentally friendly choice because they've been manipulated into thinking that. You get into your SUV, you think, wow, it's a small car. I'm doing something good for the environment. I feel very comfortable. Of course you do. It's like an S-Class.
Maximum luxury with a clear conscience. That's the Mercedes promise. But environmentalists argue that the best choice is no cars at all. But wanting more is an instinct that's deeply anchored in our brains.
That's because the brain isn't set up for less, but for more, for maximization. Look what happens when we get more than we expected. Dopamine is released in the brain's happiness center, and we experience a kick, a rush, something positive and pleasurable. This maximizing is built into our brain. We experience it as a positive feeling. The opposite is experienced as dumb.
So that means climate protection needs to be fun.
Nobody saves the world because it's the ethical thing to do. You save the world if you have a clear benefit right now, and it makes sense in the long run. For example, if I want to buy organic, it has to be because that's cool now, not because it saves the world in 30 years' time. There has to be an immediate benefit. Then people will change their behavior.
Is that the problem with the energy transition? That people feel they're being burdened? And because they think renewables are costing them more, they aren't going along with it.
Affordability would be leverage. Instead, we try to solve problems in even more complicated ways and tell people to be ethical. We're completely unaware of the basics of human thinking. We want to maximize what we have. The trick now should be to combine this with a narrative about sustainability and sustainable products. Only then will we get somewhere.
Climate researcher Mojib Latif and most of his colleagues have been telling the world about global warming for decades, but to no avail. Now, young people are trying to stop climate change with various forms of protest. But it seems that most of us will only act if we can really see the benefits of protecting the environment. But if we don't, there will be no way of preventing climate catastrophe.